All right, Heart Talkers, welcome in today to a podcast where we have everyday conversations with everyday people. And today we are talking about something that's kind of hard for me to talk about. And it's been hard for me ever since I've been a kid. And when I came across Jeremy Allen and the work that he does with Death Ed, I just knew that I needed to reach out to him. I knew that this was going to be a conversation that I could lean in and learn and listen and get some new perspective on these hard topics of grief and death. Because listen, none of us are getting out of here without meeting those topics face to face. So, Jeremy, welcome today.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. Oh, always exciting to have the opportunity to share the stage with grief. So excited for today.
Well, it's funny. My husband's like, "So who do you have coming on today?" I'm like, "Well, actually, he is embalmer and a funeral director." And my husband's like, "What? You are actually going to sit and have a conversation with someone who does that work because he knows me very well. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
He knows me very well. So let's get right into it. I always like to start by asking the question that is so simple yet so layered and complex. So let's start with this. Who are you, Jeremy Allen?
Yeah. Well, I'll start surface level, like with the biographical response, which is, um, well, I'll introduce myself. My name's Jeremy Allen. I am a husband and a dad, and professionally speaking, I'm a funeral director and embalmer that also educates on grief and loss. And so the who you are is such a unique question to try to answer, right? Like it's like this deep dive into, and I think the deeper response is, as you'll hopefully see as we get further into these topics and conversations, just somebody that's become very passionate about talking about hard things. And I find when you've had the opportunity to be exposed to the environments of loss over such an extended period of time, you just really learn what meaningful conversation is truly about. Just it doesn't matter how the Oilers are doing or what the weather is today. There's just so much better things to talk about. So it gets me excited.
Yeah. So where did you grow up?
So I grew up in a rural setting. I grew up in Wainwright, Alberta, and I mean, it's a smaller town in rural Alberta, and born and raised. So I'd like to speak openly. Grew up very white, very privileged, very in a setting that just allowed for me to always be very safe.
Hmm.
Um, I grew up like my dad was an educator. My mom was mostly a stay-at-home mom, worked out of the house a little bit, but just very well looked after. Grew up in a fairly emotionally present environment, which probably, you know, transcended into some of these things that I've grown as skills in my adult life. But still grew up rural. Like I don't it's just so much different. I've lived in the city. I've experienced urban life, but just a small town guy, and that's where I continue to live. So my wife and I moved to this place called Provost, which is right on the Alberta-Saskatchewan border,
Hmm.
back in 2009, shortly after we got married, and that's when we since then like we bought a funeral home in rural Alberta and have been operating it since 2009.
Okay, well let's talk about that. I mean, not often do you hear a little kid say, when I grow up, I want to be a funeral director and probably an embalmer too. And I find it fascinating when I talk to people how their careers found them or how they found
Yeah,
their career. So let's talk about that. How did your journey come to find your calling as a funeral director and embalmer?
that's funny. I agree with you. You don't hear that response often, and that certainly wasn't me. I've met a few of those people. Most of them can be a little bit weird, to be honest, if that's what you grew up thinking you were going to be. I so I remember being so I'm 38 now, and I remember being 16, 17 years old, and like just that stage of life where we become very intense on young people to start deciding what they're going to do for the rest of their life, especially in my generation. And so anyways, it was 16, 17, and those questions of what are you going to do for the rest of your life were starting to surface. And for me, like I grew up in a lineage of educators. So my
Mm.
dad was a teacher, my grandfather was a teacher, my uncle was a teacher. All of them did, had very successful careers. Most of them worked in administration. One was a superintendent. My dad worked with the Alberta Learning Network. So just lots of background in education. So one of my responses was, well, maybe I'll be a teacher, kind of following in those family footsteps. And then I also grew up in a pretty like religious or church background setting. And the other idea was like to work with youth. Like I did a lot of like youth group stuff growing up and Bible camps and things like that. Other settings I really enjoyed. But then what didn't make sense about those things was number one, I wasn't a good student. Like I didn't like going to school. School was never a place that like I didn't enjoy structured learning. So being a teacher didn't make an incredible amount of sense. And then like I just liked to drink and party and do things. So being a youth pastor didn't really seem like a plausible outcome either. And so how I landed in funeral service was in my grade 12 year. So my dad was actually the vice principal of the school at the time, but I got caught cheating on my social 30 diploma and almost got expelled. And so not a bit of a black stain on the Allen family name in that school, but through that experience ended up getting through that, not getting expelled, was able to rewrite, like took ownership of what I had done, and ultimately I was on my way back from Edmonton where that test was rewritten, and my parents were just like, your aunt works at a funeral home in Calgary, and they're looking for some help, and we think it'd be a good change of scenery for you to maybe go give this a try. I was like, well, that sounds awful. I'm not interested in doing that at all. And they were like, well, too bad. Like, we're going to Calgary. Your suit's in the trunk. You've got an interview. Like, you're gonna, you need to have this change of scenery. So that's how I got into funeral service. I got caught cheating on a social 30 test,
Wow.
almost got expelled. And like basically that was like my parents' response was you need a change of scenery. And they, it's funny. I
That
look back, I don't say to say any of it with resentment. Like I look back and I go, yeah, like they weren't wrong. Like I can see, why you don't want your kids to get stuck in these patterns or these spaces that sometimes accompany small towns. And but I was like barely 18. Like I was like literally, it was like I just graduated. I was barely 18, and then was just moving to like moved in, and it wasn't like a slow entry. The funeral home that I worked for in Calgary, they serve approximately 3,000 families a year. So it was
mm.
just like, you know, a lot of exposure in a very short amount of time.
Yeah, I'm thinking
And so I,
that is a change of scenery. I mean, I have threatened my children with boarding school, like if you don't, you mean we're going to send you
yeah,
that is a yeah, now
heck
you're
with boarding school, like let's throw you into the funeral service and see how you do.
wow.
And so, so it was like I did it for about a year, from 18 till about 19. Um, so did it for about a year, got homesick is what it really came down to. Didn't think it was for me, so I got out of it. And I remember sitting with my boss at the time, and I gave my notice, and I just remember saying like, thank you for this opportunity. It's been a great year. I just don't think this is for me. And then I remember him saying, like you now I'm 38, right? So like you look back at how young 18 is or 19
Mm,
is, right? And I remember he was just like, I accept your resignation. I don't think you're right. I think this is a good fit for you.
mm,
And I think you're going to be back one day. And I was like, it's like, everything, right? At that stage of your life, you're like, no way. Like, I'm done. Like, I would know this is not for me. He's like, okay, well, good luck. And anyway, so back to Wainwright. And this is the thing about living rural. Like, when you live rural, there's only so many outcomes, meaning there's only so much you can do in a rural setting without post-secondary. So I moved back, bartended. That one, actually, I'll be honest, that went really well. Like that was a great fit for my personality. But then that brought my family to this place, or my parents back to this place. Like shortly after that, it was like, well, what are you going to do for the rest of your life, right? Like you can't do this forever. And so it was like, okay, well, I'm going to go back to school then, like post-secondary. I went to, and I got accepted into McEwen for my Bachelor of Commerce degree because I thought, well, I like business.
mm,
And so anyways, back into McEwen, started that fall. And my first semester at McEwen, I dropped out of 4 classes and failed my fifth. And it was just like, I told you guys, this wasn't, you should have just let me bartend. So back to Wainwright once more. And then again, rural Alberta, so it was like then it was the oil field. So I had an opportunity to do the oil field, and was working up by Beaver Lodge. So got into the oil field, was working up by Beaver Lodge, which is by Grand Prairie in
Mhm.
northern Alberta, and and it had a pretty bad accident. I had a really, I had a 1,500 pound piece of pipe fall on me, and
Yeah.
quite a bit of damage. I ended up like getting rushed into the hospital for surgery, and ultimately what happened was just like through the surgery, my parents drove up to GP where the surgery was, and by the time I was out of surgery, they were there, and basically a quick day in the hospital, and got stabilized, and they're like, okay, head home. And it was about an 8 hour drive back to Wainwright with my parents, and then it was like, well, what are you going to do for the rest of your
Mhm.
life? Like that just felt like the theme for those first, from 16 till 20 was just like, try something, fail, you know, and then have another conversation about what are you going to do. And it just, I look back at it and I just think now, as the lens of an adult, I think like it's such an unusual and unnecessary amount of pressure we put on young people
Yeah.
to try to decide what they're going to do for the rest of their life when I'm 38 and still working my way through parts of that conversation, right? But through that, even in that short amount of time, like this all happened before the age of 20. And
Wow.
yeah, and
You could
so
write
then
you could write a book just from 18 to
yeah,
20.
I know it's just so crazy. And then it was like I'm like, these wouldn't be the words I would use when I was that age, but looking back now with experience, basically on that drive home, I had said, like, truly, of all these things I've experienced, the only space that I found meaning in was when I was working at the funeral home. And I think the
Mhm.
thing that I was really drawn to was a deep recognition, even from a really young age, that I was able to appreciate how families trusted us to join them
Yeah.
during one of the most significant experiences of their life, right? And I felt like that was such an amazing thing, to be trusted to help in this really unique and meaningful space. And so that's when I made the decision to re-enter funeral service. It was like, of these experiences that I'd had up until that point in time in my life, hands down, I knew that was the most meaningful opportunity of the spaces that I'd had a chance to belong to. So I re-entered, funeral service at the age of 20, and I've been doing it ever since. I had about six
Wow.
months where I was laid up from that accident and surgery. Um, so I was like, I joke, like I did online school before online school was, a thing, or before it was cool.
Mm.
And so I did my first semester from home while I healed, and then re-entered in basically the spring or winter of 2006, and then have just things have just kind of gone my way. Like, was
Yeah.
was very passionate about the work, things, and was raised in an environment that taught me how to combine passion and work ethic. And so the combination of those two things eventually led me to, at a very young age, I was 24 and my wife was 23 when we moved to Provost and bought the funeral home.
Wow.
So even looking at that, it's just a lot of unique opportunities and circumstances, and to answer like at the beginning end of this, the how did you end up here? What made you to decide what you're going to do? And I just made this realization not too long ago. I said to this to my dad. I was like, when you guys were asking me those questions at 16 and 17 years old, and my answers was, well, be a teacher or be a youth pastor. It's like now I'm 38 and I'm reflecting back on those answers. I'm going like, what's really neat in a completely different way, in a completely different capacity. I'm educating people,
Yeah.
and the group that I've become most passionate about educating in this topic is youth and children. I was
Mhm.
like, so I ended up doing these two things that I imagined myself being at 16 or 17 years old, but in such a different role than I ever would have pictured.
And in an incredibly important space because not many people are talking about it. And I'm
Right.
I love when you say like when you did that year with the first funeral home and your boss when you said, "Okay, thanks, here's my resignation. Thanks, I think I'm done. This isn't for me." And he said, "I think you're wrong. Like I think
Mhm.
you'll be back." So what do you think he saw in you back then that makes you fit for that job? Because it does require a certain skill set and a certain level of emotional intelligence and
Right.
compassion. So what do you think he saw in you?
I think connection. Like I think one of the things that has allowed me a lot of success in my career is authentic connection with people.
Mhm.
I'm very empathy driven. Like I'm definitely an empath, And one of the things that has just allowed me that space of connection in funeral services is I think empathy is a superpower. Like the
Mm,
ability for us to remove our own experiences or our own judgments to just authentically meet people in the space that they're in, right? And so to be able to do that in funeral service is so necessary because, when people walk through grief and as importantly as they begin to mourn, right? Like when we mourning for me is where we activate in our grief and start to participate in the emotion outwardly.
yeah.
So, well, a lot of settings for us that we grew up in, like a lot of that was done through rituals and traditions, typically attached to faith, right? So
Hmm.
and when you work in urban centers, like we did in Calgary, for example, well, like there's so many faiths and religions in the world that we live in. So it doesn't matter that I grew up in a you know Pentecostal Protestant Christian driven family. When you're serving somebody in this space of funeral service, whether you're Catholic, whether you're Muslim, whether you're Buddhist, whether you're Sikh, whether you're, like regardless of what you are, my responsibility is to authentically show up in that space that helps you take care of this person that you love
Yeah.
and in a way that honors your traditions and your rituals and like I've been invited into your space. I'm not inviting you into my space
Mm,
with the expectation of how I think this should go, right?
right.
And
And
so
honestly, also the two things that are universal, no matter where we come from, who we are, what we practice for religion, is love and pain, and we will experience both.
right.
And I'm sure you have seen that regardless of culture, faith. I mean, the process looks very similar of grief. Yeah.
Sure. I think grief is the great equalizer, right?
Mm,
Like, I mean, it is because no matter again, regardless of whatever religious system or atheist system, like non-religious systems that your life operates off of, one thing I know to be completely true is that grief is rooted in relationship, right?
yeah.
Like that the emotion that is going to come. So grief is our emotional and behavioral response to loss, not specifically to death. It's a very present set of emotions when it comes to people we love dying. But so to me, when we apply to that setting and we talk about it from that context, is just where it is the great equalizer because the reality is as much as we can sometimes have the opportunity to prepare for loss, it doesn't mean that we're ready for it.
Hmm.
Meaning whether it's our 90-year-old mom or our 15-year-old sibling, like there's still like it's still a relationship, right? And
Right.
so that's where even when like in those religious settings or just again, like I think the part for me that I'm just very in tune with and have been from a very young age was just these are just sons and daughters that are missing their mom or their dad or their grandpa or their grandma or their whoever that person is, right? And I mean, professionally speaking, we have a responsibility to learn what it likes to honor that person within that lens of tradition and ritual.
Hmm.
But beyond that, the emotionally intelligent part of that conversation is investing into the relationship part also. And I think that's where even for me as a young person coming into funeral service, I think not again the words I would have used then, but looking back, I think I saw that opportunity where it was just like, what, professionally speaking, we have a terrific responsibility to get very good at what we do,
Yeah.
whether that's as an embalmer or as a funeral director. And to me, though, that's baseline. Like because of the accessibility we've had to technology and education and just experience at this stage of life, we have the tools to get functionally good at what we do, right? To
Hmm.
learn those things. So that's a baseline expectation, in my opinion, where we get very good at what we do. And I think this expands outside of funeral service. I think this is any profession in the world today um, is in our ability to create relationships, to be
Yes.
emotionally invested in the outcome of the people that we're trying to serve, and
Yeah.
that's different than emotionally attaching ourselves to their outcome.
Yeah.
but like for them to feel that we are invested in what happens to them, right?
Yeah. Oh, I wholeheartedly believe that. I had an experience today when I had gone in for a specialist appointment, and there was a couple of other ladies in the waiting room, and it was all heightened, anxiety. We're not all there because things are going well, with our health.
Right. Yeah, for
We
sure.
all know we're there because, there's some inquiries and we got to see
Yeah.
what's going on. And the one lady and I connected so well, and it reminded me of what you just said. It's about like building a relationship. So we're both strangers. I don't know her from a hole in the wall, but I can feel and sense just from you know, my own programming, and I am also highly like empathetic and intuitive, and I know she's carrying a lot. So we start having a conversation, and she comes closer to me, and she just loses it. She starts bawling, and she says, "My daughter has been missing for 30 days now in Calgary. We have no idea where she is." And we're all sitting, and the other lady's crying, and I'm trying to hold it together. And I did what I knew to do best was tell me her name. Tell me about her. Let's talk about her, build her. By the time we're done, they're calling us in for, next to go for the diagnostic. We're hugging, we're telling them to wait, like we're not done yet. So I can imagine that you have had countless numbers of interactions, that real heart to heart, hard stuff that not everybody is programmed for, And I read that you said in one of your posts or on your website that you have a love for grief. And I have to tell you, Jeremy, I was like, why would you have a love for grief? Now, let's talk about that. What do you mean by that?
I think if you've experienced the fullness of grief, it starts to make a lot more sense.
Hmm.
Um, so my personal lens on this, like meaning if I apply this to the personal relationships in my life where I've experienced loss, I love grief from a lens that grief is the opportunity to have an extended relationship, with that person. It is the
Hmm.
space that we have the opportunity for that relationship to carry into, right? So when I stop and I think about influential people in my life that I really loved that have died, when I think about my grandparents that I was very close with, and if I pause and I just like close my eyes and I start to think about my grandpa and my grandma and like just the presence that they had in my life, and then I start to like get emotionally connected to that, and I start to truly like I can start to feel their presence within me again. And
Hmm.
it's just like that's a really wonderful thing. Like I
Yeah.
think that is my opportunity to like continue to feel their continued presence
Mm.
still impact who I'm becoming,
Mm.
right? And so I believe like we, in order to fully feel that, that means I have to fully accept the sadness that accompanies that I'll never feel or see their physical presence ever again. And that
Yeah.
still can be sad 10 years after they've died. Um, but the thing is if I've allowed myself to acknowledge and feel that part, then it also creates the space for like joy to start to enter.
Yeah.
That like all of a sudden that and I've had to learn to be, when I say more cautious with this part of the conversation, what I say with it is it's not an expectation. Like my love of grief doesn't mean or shouldn't create an expectation that others will ever feel that way.
Right.
Um, because I've never lost a child.
Right.
So, losing a child and grieving a child, it would make sense to me that as a parent, you may never get to the, that space of finding any type of relief
Right.
attached to, to their physical presence no longer being available to you. And like I'm okay with that. Like I think that's the part where I
Hmm.
go, like what I've learned to talk about these things, I'm very open about them, that these are the things that I feel in this environment, but that doesn't mean it should create an expectation
Right.
for somebody else.
But I think
But
like,
I would love for them to be open-minded
mm,
that grief also doesn't, so I think when people think about the immediate emotions that typically accompany grief, right? And if we stay in the setting of people we love dying, um, but the emotions that, and honestly, let's expand beyond that. Even thinking for this mom that you ran into whose daughter's been missing for 30 days, right? Like think
Mhm.
of the grief attached to
Yeah.
having a missing child, right?
Mhm.
And like just all of the emotion that accompanies that. And the part of that is like, so in those immediate parts of those experiences, like it's typically sadness, it's anger, it's denial, it's these very tangible things that we feel. And of course there's almost nothing attractive about those
Yeah.
parts of grief, right? That just makes sense to me. Typically with time gives us the opportunity to revisit our grief, where we can start to re-experience these things and start to pull meaning out of it, right?
Mhm.
Where now it's just like with enough time and with enough contrast and with the reality that joy and sorrow can coexist in
Yeah.
this environment of grief, I can start to revisit these experiences and possibly learn something from it. Like maybe there's something very meaningful attached to this person no longer being in my life, right?
Yeah.
Not better. And like that's important to say. It
Yeah.
doesn't mean it's better without them, but like what a wonderful way for us to begin to honor these people and to begin to create space for them to still have a presence in our active life by revisiting the loss and
Mhm.
starting to find the things about that maybe made us better
Yeah.
or have created the opportunity for us to grow and the opportunity for us to honor ourselves at a higher level and in turn show up for one another at a higher level. I think those opportunities exist in grief.
Yeah, and I think that's a beautiful way to look at it because we can't change it. We can't the
Right.
physical when they're physically gone, they're gone. And I have a really good friend who lost a daughter. And she has taught me so much about grief because that, of course, as a parent is one of my biggest fears in life.
Of course.
And she's walking and she's walked it for 7 years. And she, she shares openly that there's been a lot of judgment toward her as well of how she's approaching and working through her grief because how can you be happy or how can you move on or how can you because everybody processes it very differently. And she's the one who first told me a few years ago when I learned that I could hold my love and grief in one hand, and joy and laughter in another. They could coexist. I didn't have to be
Mm.
miserable my whole life. I thought, that's growth, and that's a lot. That's a lot coming from someone who, has done the what most of us, can't even imagine having to do.
Right. And I think that's the part. And like it this is this could become a very misunderstood statement, so I'll do my best to explain it. I think it's why one of my favorite environments to serve in is when children die.
Mm,
And what I mean by that is, of course, I am not a fan of when that happens. I just feel so equipped to be a part of those experiences because of how much I've learned from those moms and dads and brothers and sisters who have had to say goodbye in my opinion, typically the most difficult
yeah.
environments or situations, right? And and when I look at those experiences and when I look at how I've watched these moms and dads and brothers and sisters, like how resilient they have to be just to be able to get out of bed and get dressed is a success, you
Hmm.
know, let alone still make food for the rest of the family or for your other kids or to be able to persevere enough to recognize that even in the midst of this tragedy that you don't know how you're going to survive, that you still have this responsibility to these other three kids, to still be a mom or still be a dad or still be a spouse or whatever it is, right? So, and I've got to share the table with these people. And like, I think that is for me one of the things that I love so much about what I do and why I think it's such a unique privilege is I think who else in the world gets to sit with these people in their immediate parts of their loss that aren't family. And like it's such a
Yeah.
short list. Like it's just like, you don't see your therapist within the days of
Right.
these people passing away. Like you don't see so it's just such a wonderful part of our career, and so bringing it, into this lens of like, these two things coexisting, right, is what I've learned at a very high level in those environments is you can't just push down on certain emotions. Meaning, if
Mhm.
you're going to take the historical approach of ignore and override,
Mm.
well, you have to be prepared that you're overriding everything, right? So if you can't just reduce the sorrow, like I think we have enough coping mechanisms that we can push down on things so that it's not such an outward response, but then you're also going to push down on the joy,
Right.
right? So everything gets reduced. And so when we meet these people that have allowed themselves to experience joy again, I think what they've realized or what they've given into is that, well, if I'm going to, are we allowed to swear on this podcast?
Yes, you are.
Okay. Okay. Um, but if we're going to, if we're going to have to go through the experience of all of the shitty days that come along with how hard grief is, and we truly allow ourselves to experience those days, well, then we're going to feel deserving of a good day, right?
Ah.
So like
Mhm.
then when the sun starts to shine, we're allowed to feel its warmth
Mm.
because like I sat in the rain and I sat in the puddles and I sat in the shit and it sucks and it is going to continue to suck and I know that it's coming again at some point in time. So if I find myself, not thinking of, and it's not that you don't think about it, but like if I find myself allowing these other parts of my life to slowly return, like where I can feel the warmth of the sun, or I
Mm.
can experience laughter with friends or family, like it's just like, oh, like what a relief,
Yeah.
that thing, that also is still available to me.
Yeah.
Whereas if you go the opposite direction, I think this is my opinion, it makes sense to me if you've pushed down or if you've tried to avoid the big emotion, the shitty days, if you find yourself in the midst of the opportunity to have joy, you don't feel deserving of it,
Mhm.
right? Because like what kind of asshole would smile or laugh or joke around in the midst of this tragedy?
Yeah.
Well, and again, like my very simple stance on that, just from watching human behavior, is typically the ones that are experiencing the joy are the ones that gave in to the hard stuff. They're the ones that said,
Right.
okay, well, like at some point in time, like I can't control the outcome and I can't control what's happened, and I also can't control the hardship that's going to accompany this. So I'm just going to give into it, right?
Wow.
And be so if I yeah, I don't know. I
No,
think
I
it makes
love that.
sense to me.
I
Sorry.
love that. That makes sense to me. That makes sense to me. I mean, I sat at the depths and the darkest part of that hole. So I deserve to feel the sunlight when I can get out of it. I
Right.
know I sent you a couple of my books because even though I'm terrified of
Yeah.
death, and grief is just something for me. I've experienced a lot of it in my life.
Yeah.
Don't love the emotions that come along with it, but have seen since I've become a parent exactly what you're talking about, the value in teaching our kids that love lives after death. My 5-year-old and
Right.
he's just starting to see, I don't know how old your kid, oh, I do know how old your kids are, but like my 5-year-old, he's just starting to learn, like, I'm not going to live forever,
Right.
and everything that comes along with that innocence, and he asked me the other day, when do our hearts stop beating, mom? And I said, I don't know, bud. It's a mystery. It's a mystery. And when they stop beating, can they start again? I'm like, oh my gosh, this is a bedtime. Like we're not going to be having this
Yeah.
conversation before, but I'm curious. Have you, as you're talking about all this, and I'm envisioning in my mind you just holding space for all these families and some of the hardest days of their lives. How do you do it without getting washed away and swept up and swallowed up by all of the emotions and the grief associated with it? Like it's got to take a toll on you.
Yeah. And I wish I could like give you a very clear answer on this. I think it is just it's some internal quality that I have that allows me to, and it's like with full transparency, like I see a therapist, like I have a
Mhm.
like psychologist that I see, and like me, it's a it's no different than going to see my doctor or going to see my dentist. Like
Mhm.
I wouldn't say right away, but fairly early in my career, I realized that like we needed somewhere to like unpack this stuff, like not just with my wife or not just with friends like that. So so I think I got in tune with that pretty early, and which gave me
Pretty good.
tools to learn how to talk about it, right? But I remember this one specific experience that I had, and it really was where probably if I tried to pinpoint professionally where I really started to investigate like the emotional part of what we do is like I went out on a call. So like one of the unique parts of the environment that we live in and work in is we work on behalf of the medical examiner. When what that means is that
Mm.
when there's an unexpected sudden death, within about 100-kilometer proximity of where we live, we're the ones that go out on scene on their behalf. So like if it's a motor vehicle accident or whatever, it doesn't like sudden unexpected. So houses, vehicle accidents, whatever the case is. And so I was out on an accident and had to like be in this functional state of mind, meaning like when I got there, like there's volunteer fire department, there was some strategies that needed to be figured out in order to get this person into the care of the funeral home vehicle. And that's my responsibility, like is to get
Mm.
there and ultimately direct the people that are there to help to make sure they understand what they do, but then very much my response. So it's like function, like fight or flight, right? So like our
Right.
prefrontal cortex isn't attached. We're in survival mode
Mm.
because we just have to get this done. And so did that. And honestly, that's just another skill that I hold. Like, I think parts of that I would make sense to me if it was comparable to like what first responders have to
Yeah,
be
I
able
was
to
gonna
do,
say.
right? Like where you just show up and it's like you just need to be able to get focused on who needs you the most and what does it take to get them from here to here, right?
Mm.
And so did that and then was able to do that. Everything went the way that it needed to go. And then it was like literally from within 5 seconds of putting this person into the care of the funeral home vehicle, like had to take off my gloves and walk across the street to enter an emotionally intelligent conversation with the family that was also still there, right? And like I just remember going back like from that experience, and it was good. Like I mean, when I say it was good, I mean like I was able to do it, meaning I know that as much as possible, they were served in that part of the experience with emotion being present, like that it wasn't rigid. It was an emotionally present conversation. And I remember like following up with my psychologist on that. And the part that bothered me wasn't anything that had to happen that day. It was like I felt like a psychopath. Like I was
Ah.
like, how do you just like, right? How do you like literally flip a switch like and walk across the road and become emotionally present after seconds before, being in this. And so it's just like, and there isn't like there isn't a direct set of steps that I followed to learn that behavior or to learn that trait. And it's not a coping mechanism. It's not, like it just was something that I've been able to do. Now, when I try to help and teach this to other professionals, I think the boundary of it or the I guess like the checkpoint for me is always this idea of like how do we become emotionally invested in the people we are trying to serve without emotionally attaching ourselves to their outcome. Meaning
Ah.
when I sit in the
Mhm.
trenches with you, you need to know that I'm sitting with you. But I also know somewhere inside of me that at the end of that day or at the end of that experience, I'm leaving your trench because I have my own life and I have my own family and I have my
Mhm.
own wife and my own kids that need me to return fully to them without your experience impacting that. Right.
Mhm. Yeah, so it would be definitely a skill that you need to practice and build on.
For
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And it
for
is.
sure.
It's like head down, and this is what. And I think that our brains are equipped and wired. They're very neuroplastic. Like we know what's needed of us in the moment. I remember when it's so crazy how those painful moments in those earliest hours and minutes of death and that you can remember where you were, what you were wearing, what you smelled. But I had a student that passed away. I was his teacher. He was in grade 11. One of the hardest things ever. And I still remember the phone call from the principal that morning. I still remember going and I had to hold space for those kids the next day. I mean, we had 20
Mm.
some kids who were coming, and they needed the adults in their space to be able to help regulate them, and help them be okay. And I think it is fascinating that the human mind and the brain, and that we have the capacity to be able to switch, do both, you know, go into
Mhm.
that like mode of and it happens, I think, in a lot of professions where you have to hold space for people who are going through hard things. I mean, I have sat side by side in the work that I do with people, whose children have taken their own lives, whose spouses have died, um you know without warning. I mean, tragic car accidents, and I always sit beside them, and I just think, I remember I said to the one mother, like, I don't know how you did it. And she said, I didn't have a choice. Like, I didn't have a choice. And
Right.
so when people say, I can't believe how strong you are, she said, there's no other choice. Like, as if I
Right.
have, you know, yeah,
Yeah, like it's either this or I give in and actually just let my heart stop beating,
and
right?
that's what she said.
Because like,
Yeah, it's either that.
and I know like, and that is like to me what's so like, and it, again, like not everybody is aligned with like this wording, but like I think that's what's so magical about grief is like it is such a steep learning curve.
Mm,
And like, when I use these terms, like magic doesn't mean good, but
yeah,
like it's still something that we can't explain,
it's very
right?
mysterious. Yep. It's and
Yeah,
it.
and so for me, I just think of like these moms and dads or brothers and sisters or whoever they are that didn't have a choice, right? And and I think we have a response of like, oh, I just can't imagine what that would be like. And I remember listening to actually another podcast, and this lady was explaining when her child had passed away, and she said, like I remember just holding my son and I remember listening to the ambulance, like and I could hear the sirens and it felt like it took 2 hours for them to get there when it was realistically probably 10 minutes,
Mhm.
and the host of that podcast was really emotional and he goes, and that's what he said. He goes, I just can't imagine. And I'll never forget this because it's like it taught me so much. And she said, we, you can imagine, you just choose not to,
Mhm.
right? And because here's what we are capable of. I think the human mind is fascinating. I think when we are willing to lead with excruciating vulnerability, I think we can connect to the emotion of what that would be like. And I think we can get ourselves to a point of trying to imagine. Now, that is a different statement than saying, I know what it's like. I do not know what it's
Mhm.
like to lose a child, but I think I can say, I am capable of trying to imagine and sitting. And I think that ultimately is the road to like probably one of the greatest examples of empathy,
Yeah.
right? Where I'm just going like, and when I've told that story in the past, because I said like, like if I sit here and if I close my eyes and I think about would what it would feel like if something happened to Harper or something happened to Dylan or something happened to Bowen, and I think about what it would feel like that what was the last thing I said to them this morning, and what was it like watching them get on the bus, and what if that were the last time I saw them, and I really start to lean into that, and like here's what happens, my breath starts to go short, like
Mhm.
my chest starts to get tight, and it's just like I'm just thinking about it, and then it's just like, oh fuck it, I can't think about it anymore, and I
Yep.
open my eyes and I stop, right? Because it's just too much, like literally, like it tightens my chest.
Yep.
And so it's just like that's the part for me is like what happens in grief, what happens in empathy when we just keep our eyes shut and we just imagine a little bit more than the last time we thought about what it would be like.
Mm.
And it's not to get to a point of ever trying to compare or ever trying to say we know what it's like. It's just to try to authentically put ourselves in that person's shoes,
Mhm.
like even if it's just for a second, right? Like even if I can just get a glimpse of what this has been like for you,
Yeah.
maybe it allows me to show up, with a higher level of understanding or a higher level of empathy. right?
Yeah. And I think
So
that's a gift
yeah,
that some of us who are gifted to work with families in whatever capacity we do, where they're growing through it,
yeah,
walking through pain, is that we learn the lessons. And every family I sit with, I'm sure it's the same thing for you. I learn more about my own relationship with grief and my own lens on because it's going to happen, and I very well can imagine what it feels like. I do that often. to my
yeah,
own to my own detriment. But I think
yeah,
that true thing of like dropping into your body and even thinking about what's that relationship after, just a couple days ago, because I've had a hard week and I've been pretty open about it, with my community, because I mean, how would I be a mental health advocate if I wasn't open about when I was struggling? And I
right,
was, I've always been like, I was very close with my grandmother. In fact, she shows up in all my books as little ladybugs because that's the divine sign we get from her.
yeah,
And I'll have
y-
ladybugs, Jeremy. I'm not shitting you. They will show up literally in the dead of winter inside a cup, like when I need a message. You can't even make that stuff up. But I was sitting
yeah,
on the
I
bed.
agree.
You can't make it up. And I was sitting on the
Yeah, I love it.
I was sitting on the bed and I said to my husband, I just had this pop in of my Oma sitting on the side of her bed because we often had good conversations there in her room. And I could feel it. I could smell her room. I could see the bookshelf. And it brought me some peace. It brought a lot of tears, but it brought me some
Yeah,
peace. So I can see how you say, when I think about it for myself, finding the love for grief, finding that softness of it, I think. Yeah.
right. Because it's like it's tangible. Grief is this tangible thing you will continue to experience, right? And it's just
Mm.
it's funny, like the grandma, one of like I was really fortunate. I got to know all of my grandparents and well. Um, like I had all of them into adulthood. And I remember this one specific experience with like Bailey and I were camping. We were out in the mountains, which is kind of like my favorite place to retreat to. And anyways, it was just like we were out, the Bailey and the kids were all sleeping, and it was like we were leaving Revelstoke that day to go to our next spot. And I got up before everybody was like, you know what, I'm just gonna like go fuel up the truck. I'm gonna get myself a coffee, like just have a quiet start because I love camping, but it's not always a beautiful experience with young kids. So
No.
it actually rarely is.
Or
So
when
it's
you're
just like
trying to, or when
yeah,
you're
I was
trying to
just
back up a camper as a
yeah,
spouse,
with exactly. Yeah. Like there's a lot of triggers
Yeah.
when you camp with a family. Anyway, and so I just like remember waking up that day and being like, man, this was like what and just honestly that part was like just rooted in gratitude. Like, like
Mm,
I've got such a wonderful life. Like, like
mm,
I've got a really wonderful partner and spouse. We've got three great kids, and I was just sitting here like in that part of my day, like where I was just able to just be grateful for the life that I have. And I get in the truck and I start driving and I'm like looking up at like the mountains and the cedar and just like and it was so like strange because like I just remember driving and thinking like, man, like I should call my grandma,
mm,
and like she would love to hear about. And it's like that particular grandma that I was thinking about that day, like she died before I got married. Like she'd been gone for
mhm,
like over 10 years. But it was just like that split second
mhm,
of, like where I was just thinking about my family and thinking about my outcome and thinking about what my life looked like. And the person I was most connected to in that moment was my grandma, who just lived selflessly for her grandkids. And I just thought like how much she would have loved to have heard about this experience that we were having as a family. And then it was just like, so here I'm like driving down this like highway in Revelstoke to get to these gas stations, thinking about my grandma, like bawling like a 2-year old that has bit his lip. Like I'm just like outwardly crying. And I like looked out the window and this poor guy next to me in traffic was just like avoiding eye contact at all costs. Like he was so uncomfortable. And then I started laughing because I realized what was going on, right? And it was just like so but the thing about that is yes, like of course it was accompanied by emotion or it was accompanied by tears in that case. But that was like the most I'd felt my grandmother's like physical presence in in a decade, like since she
mhm,
had died. And it
mhm,
was just like for me, in a completely different way than we imagine when our people are alive. But for me, in that moment, she was still as much with me as she's ever been,
Yeah.
right? And still shaping who I'm becoming, still
Yeah.
shaping who my kids will become. That created the opportunity for me to talk about my grandma with my kids that day, or with Bailey that day, or when I got home and got to talk with my dad about my grandma, who was his mom. Like, where it's just like it
Hmm.
gives us the opportunity to continue to say their name and to continue to let them have a presence in our family, right? That
Hmm.
even though they're gone, they're still very much a part of this family, right?
Because that's the power of such deep relationship and such deep love is that
Right.
it lives through you, you know. I know
Yeah.
my 5-year-old talks about Oma Ellie. He's never met her. You know, she passed away
Yeah.
years before he was born, but she has like this legacy. It's like, and I said to
Right.
my husband, that's what I want to create for my kids is that even when I'm gone, I'm not ever going to really be gone, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And I think what allows that to happen is, and I think this is like another really neat part of my career, was like, I mean, I was close with my grandparents, but I also got to know hundreds of people from their generation,
Mm,
maybe thousands. And like that's really unique because not everybody got to know older people other than their family members, right? And I think what created that legacy was they weren't focused on a legacy. They were just focused on relationship. They
yeah.
were just focused on being present when they were able to be with their kids, and focused
Wow.
on being present when they were with their grandkids, right? And that created this legacy. And like the words I would put to what you talked about, like how like that the deepness of that is, and I've said this about grief for such a long time, is that we experience loss to the level in which we've experienced relationship. And so, why do I think grief is so important? Well, because it means they took the time to be a mom, or they took the time to be a grandma, or a dad, or a grandpa. And I mean, to sit here and to feel like you don't know how you're going to go on without them, like that's so encouraging to me, because it means they took the time to have, like, to be
Yeah.
somebody in your life, right? And I think that's the part where it's like when I talk about, like, grief is worth the price of admission, meaning imagine if this person you loved, so like this person that you're grieving, imagine if there was no emotion attached to them being gone.
Mm.
Like that would be a tragedy,
Hmm.
right? And like whether that's a parent or a spouse or a child, like what would scare the shit out of me is like if there was no emotion
Right.
attached to them not being here anymore, right? Like where you were able to just process it and functionally move forward, or try to move on. Yeah, so it's just, I don't know, like it's such a, I'm learning to try to find my words probably a little bit better with it than I have in the past. Like that, again, that it doesn't create an expectation. It's
Mm.
just, I'm so encouraged by big grief, because like that almost 100% of the time reverse engineers into a very meaningful relationship.
Hmm.
And if we can get you to look at it even just occasionally from that lens, like maybe it starts to give you like that. I think you can still be grateful in the midst of this tragedy,
Yeah.
right?
And I
Like,
think
and if you can start,
sorry, I was going to say, I think that we don't, I was just having this aha moment when we were talking, thinking about how compassionate and gentle the funeral director was, at my grandmother's funeral, at some of my loved
mhm,
ones' funeral. And I think that as a society, we undervalue the work that you do, as funeral directors and embalmers. And because I'm almost getting emotional saying this, like you're guiding our loved ones home,
right,
to the next dimension, whatever it is that we believe. And you
right,
are the ones that are holding the space in the most vulnerable time, even more vulnerable than when the doctor brought them in to life.
right,
And so
yeah,
I am so grateful for this conversation because, well, first of all, I've never never had a face-to-face conversation with an embalmer and a funeral director, but I think the community listening here would probably love to hear a couple of your best grief tips. And because here's what people always say to me: I just don't know what to say. Like, I don't know what to do. There's that awkwardness because we don't talk about it a lot, which is why I wrote a book about it for kids, why you're educating
Right,
kids about it. Like, let's talk about it. It's the elephant in the
right.
room. But what should we say or shouldn't we say in those times of deep grief to someone we love or someone who's in our circle?
Feel like the most important part is to not lose yourself to trying to find the right words. And I'll say this, like I literally say this to families is, I find that words almost always fall short in these moments, right?
Mhm.
Because there is no appropriate combination of words that is going to relieve what you're feeling. Like I know that.
Yeah.
So I could speak like, I could speak like the Dalai Lama and it just wouldn't matter in certain moments.
Mhm.
Now, what does matter, and like it's I think I need to remember who made the quote, if it was Maya Angelou but like basically it was the concept of, very rarely will people remember what we say to them, but they will always remember how we make them feel, right?
Mhm.
So my way of reapplying that into this environment of trying to have a conversation where somebody's died or like where something big and sad has happened and we're not sure of how to do it. If you are showing up authentically with a desire to sit in the discomfort with that person,
Mhm.
it almost doesn't matter what you say. Like because there's a tangible feeling
Oh.
of you're able to allow them to feel that like I desire to be here with you, right?
Mhm.
That I'm going to sit in the discomfort of not knowing what to say so that we can remove the opportunity for there to be long-term resentment attached to just not doing anything,
Yeah.
right? And so I think, the first part of that too is like, and I'll reapply this especially to when somebody passes away, when people die, because that's where I've learned these lessons. We have to learn to be unafraid of talking about what happened, like appropriately, meaning like so a big thing that I talk about is like say their name. Like don't be
Yeah.
afraid to say the person's name, right?
Yeah.
And the reason is that like so often it's like you run into them in the grocery store, you run it like again, I'll talk about like we live in a small town. Like when something sad happens here, you're guaranteed to see that person, whether it's at the IGA or whether it's at the hockey rink or wherever it is, right? And people that feel like they aren't equipped for that will literally just they'll just leave and come back for their groceries later. Like if
Yeah.
they see you there,
Yeah.
right? Like we're just like, well, fuck it. I guess we're not getting milk today. And ran
I'm
into Sarah and I just didn't know what to say, so I left.
yeah.
And right. And it's funny, but it's just so true. Like
It's
it also
true.
is just right. And we can't do that, like because like that's a very isolating experience. Now with that, it's just like so when I talk about saying their name and why I think it's so appropriate, when I think of like when I think of our friend Barry and Michelle and their son Hayden that died, when I see them and I say Hayden's name, I've not reminded them that Hayden is dead. Like there is nobody more aware
Mhm.
of Hayden's missing presence than his mom and dad and his brother and sisters, right? So talking about Hayden, saying his name doesn't remind them that he's gone. It reminds them that he lived. It reminds them that they are in the presence of somebody that is also comfortable with them talking about Hayden, that they can share with me the experiences that they are continuing to have without their son's physical presence being a part of their life anymore, and that I'm interested in being a part of that conversation, right? And I know that when we do that, it isn't uncommon for there to be emotion that accompanies it, and that's
Yeah.
okay with me. And the goal needs to shift from the goal should not be to remove the emotion from these conversations. The goal should be to remove the fear that we should not be scared to talk to one
Wow.
another about what's going on in your life, right? So so how do we do that? Well, by leading with that vulnerability, by being the one that's willing to say, "Hey, listen, you know, when I walked in, I saw you, and I'll be honest, I just about turned around because I didn't know what to say, but it was important for me to say hello. I need you to know that even in my uncertainty of what to say, like I'm thinking about you, and I want you to know that I'm thinking about you.
Wow.
And you don't have to say anything back to me. You don't have to talk to me. And like, even in a text message, right? Sometimes in our generation, that's the most likely way people are going to make that first connection is
Yeah.
to even send a message and say, listen, I don't know what to say, and I wish I had, I wish I had the words to try to provide you with a higher level of support or to communicate what I want to say to you. But what was most important to me was just that you heard from me, that I
Mm,
wasn't going to stay silent. And I don't need you to reply to this message. I don't need to be, you don't, I feel like I'm able to recognize you have a lot going on in your world right now. So I'm not looking to add to that. But I did want you to know that I'm thinking about you and that I'm in your corner. And if it's okay, I'd like to check in from time to time.
wow.
Right.
That's it, it sounds so simple. I
Right.
think we overcomplicate things, and that simple fact of, I just want you to know that I care. I just want you to know that I'm
Right.
thinking about you. You don't need to respond, not to add to the burden. Um, and
Right.
I,
You've got enough shit on your plate. The last
yeah,
thing I need to do is be another person you feel like you need to
yeah,
make sure is okay.
yeah.
Right. Yeah.
I'm getting better because I grew up in the same kind of family, sounds similar to you, where I was the skills of empathy were modeled. There was high emotional intelligence. That is the reason why I can hold space and do the things I do. But there are times, and it's not too long ago, I did exactly what you said. I saw someone who I knew had lost somebody close, and I so sorry that I did this. I know she saw me, but she was sitting with a group of other women. And I'm like, do I go and make a scene and bring it all up and make her sad? Or do I just walk out like I never saw her? And
Right.
regretfully, I just walked out.
Yeah.
And sometimes we make mistakes, and sometimes that's, because we're human. I think it's bringing this to the forefront of conversation about how, the more we practice it and the more we lean into getting to those vulnerable positions where we're like, not afraid of the tears, not afraid of it. That's really where we touch people's hearts. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And I think that is like one of the lessons I try to teach about, like that I think segues really well into this is it's the idea of learning to lead with that excruciating vulnerability, right? Like where we see these opportunities or we see these moments where we have the opportunity to authentically connect. And then but what's often required is somebody in that equation needs to be able to lead with excruciating vulnerability, knowing that we're about to
Mm.
enter something that is going to be accompanied by big feelings. Because like this is I think the um what's the word that I'm looking for? Basically, I think this is what happens when we do that is when we lead with excruciating vulnerability, it creates a connection, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so once we become more connected, it begins to build trust. And then once I built trust with you, it leads to a more meaningful relationship.
Mm.
And if I can have a more meaningful relationship with you, it'll actually allow me a seat at your table, right?
Yeah.
Now you start to tell me what it's been like. Now you start to tell me that, we get past the how's it going, yeah, it's good. Like, like where, like, how was this week? It was awful.
Mm-hmm.
I was at hockey and it just really reminded me of when my son used to play hockey.
Right.
And it just led to a really shitty week, right? So just like you reach such a different type of conversation when you lead with vulnerability. If I come in guarded, unwilling to try to pursue that or persevere that discomfort,
Mm-hmm.
very unfair of me to think you, the griever, should show me how, right? Like it's
Mm.
just like the last thing they need to do is become the teacher to the other people.
Ooh, that's powerful. That is
Yeah.
powerful. Hmm. So I'm curious because you do live in a smaller community. You would see many of the families that you serve again.
Mhm.
So I'm curious. I mean, how does that work out? I mean, do you get to cross paths with them, have conversations? Are you kind of involved in their lives after the
Yeah,
death, after the process?
like I would say fairly often. Like again, it's a small town. Like we live in a community of 2,000 people. So like yes, like almost always we are reconnected with these families because when we often know them before too.
Mm-hmm.
And but I've also just like just really love that part. I've really spent my career, like I've allowed myself to just be a person outside of my profession, right? So like in the community, I'm in a hoodie and I'm wearing a hat, and like I'll if we're out with friends, I'll have a drink. If we're,
Mm-hmm.
like whatever the environment is, like I've just allowed myself to not be defined through my roles of being a funeral director or being an
Gotcha.
embalmer, right? And I like the way that I would try to explain it is just I think what we've been able to model is just I believe our community knows how much I love what I do, and I take what I do like seriously. Like I I work really hard to be good at what I do. I just allow myself to have a life outside of that.
Yeah.
So I want to be very good at what I do, but I don't want to, like I wouldn't ever want to be described as like I wouldn't want it to be who I am. Does that make sense? I don't
Mm-hmm.
want my career to be my identity. I just want to be a good person. I want to be an
Yeah.
empathetic person. I want to be a good person. I want to be somebody that was just known for caring and helping other people.
Mm.
Not because I'm a funeral director. I just want that to be like my personal traits. So when I see people in our community outside of like my work setting, that even if we've served them, like it's still a personal approach. It's just like, hey, like like at the IGA, like I'm the one that will walk up to them and give them a hug and say
Yeah.
hello and ask, and say like, what, good for you. You're getting groceries. Like
Mm-hmm.
that's a success. Like great
Mm-hmm.
to see you out kind of thing, right? And stop for coffee if you need anything. Like and mean it. And so I think it's a unique part of our career because I think, again, in urban centers, very unlikely you're gonna, have those run-ins. And for in rural setting, it's very likely that you will,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And I think for me, where I've just been able to be not just okay with that, like I think it's another great part of doing it in this setting is we've had the opportunity to serve you professionally, but then you will also get to know me personally,
Mm.
like not necessarily as a friend, but on the same breath as you will see me not with a black suit and a white shirt and a black tie on, like you'll
Yeah.
see me in sweatpants
Yeah.
because sometimes we just need a gallon of milk, and so you just run out in whatever you're wearing, and that's okay, right?
Mhm. Isn't it
Yeah.
crazy to think now when you look back that, cheating on a social studies exam led you to everything that you've experienced in this career of yours and holding space
Yeah,
for all of these families? And I think that's one of the beautiful mysteries of life is that like our career paths often find us,
right.
and that we go down trajectories that we would just never imagine. It has been, I can't even believe it's been over an hour. We've been chatting about this. I have learned so much from you in this hour. I think that I could have you on again easily. There's so many things we still didn't talk about, but I want to thank you so much for being vulnerable with my audience and I.
Oh gosh, this is just like one of my favorite things to do. So thanks for the opportunity. Like truly, I'll end with gratitude because you know what, like the thing about it is, and I learned this again this past year, um, but is like where I ended up in my career. It's like the harder you try to control the outcome, the more out of control it gets, right? And so it's just to me, it was like the fact that I ended up in this life that I'm in is, you know, I always joke about because I've come from that religious background. Like I make a lot of joke about God's plan, right? It's not my favorite term, but it's just
Mm,
like whatever is out there that is bigger than us. Like whatever
mm,
whatever it is that you choose to believe in that is bigger than us. I just think like there's no way in the world I could have predicted this outcome,
mhm,
or I could have tried to accomplish this, at the result of my own hands or the result of my own work. Like it was
mm.
just there is this idea of like it's just where I'm supposed to be.
Yeah.
And yeah, so it's neat when you give into that part too, because it's just like again, like for me, the connection I made to those questions of being 16 or 17, and I'm just like I'm doing almost exactly what I said I wanted to do at that age,
Mhm.
just never how I imagined it was going to be, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm super fortunate. I've got such a good life, and yeah, it's good.
Yeah,
I see it.
it's your divine purpose, and it just worked its
Yeah,
way in a very mysterious way, huh? Well, thank you,
yeah,
Jeremy.
yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank
I feel
you.
so honored that you joined me today. And I
Yeah,
know that we'll be crossing paths again.
wonderful. Well, thanks so much.